A gunshot shattered the night silence, sending Josephine Bennett running for her life through the unforgiving Arizona Territory wilderness of 1878. Blood trickled down her arm where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't stop, not with 4 men from the McClintock gang still hunting her after she'd witnessed their brutal stagecoach robbery. For 3 days, she had been running, hiding, and praying, with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and the locket containing her parents' portraits clutched in her trembling hand. Josephine's legs finally gave out as dawn approached. The silhouette of a wagon train appeared in the distance, its occupants still slumbering in the early morning light. Summoning her last reserves of strength, she crawled toward the nearest wagon, slipping beneath it just as consciousness abandoned her. Vaughn Sullivan had been riding the perimeter of the wagon train since before sunrise, checking for signs of trouble. The tall, broad-shouldered cowboy had joined the caravan as a hired gun 3 weeks prior, escorting the group of settlers to their promised land in California. At 32, his weathered face and calloused hands told stories of hard years spent beneath the relentless western sun, while his piercing blue eyes remained vigilant, always watching the horizon. As the first golden rays of morning light spilled across the plains, Vaughn guided his dappled gray stallion back toward camp. The settlers would be stirring soon, eager to continue their journey. That's when he spotted something unusual beneath the Henderson family's wagon, a crumpled form that hadn't been there when he'd ridden out. Dismounting quietly, Vaughn approached with caution, his hand hovering near the Colt revolver on his hip. What he found stopped him cold. A young woman lay curled on her side, her chestnut hair tangled with dust and brambles, her simple blue dress torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. For a moment, he thought she might be dead, but then he caught the slight rise and fall of her chest. Without hesitation, Vaughn shrugged off his worn leather coat and gently laid it over her shivering form. The early morning desert air carried a chill that cut to the bone, and the woman, whoever she might be, looked like she'd been through hell already. "Miss?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her, noting the dried blood on her arm and the exhaustion etched into her young face. She couldn't be more than 25, he guessed, wondering what circumstances had brought her here, alone and injured in the wilderness. The commotion drew the attention of Martha Henderson, who emerged from her wagon with a gasp. "Lord have mercy. Vaughn, who is she?" "Don't know, madam," Vaughn replied, keeping his voice low. "Found her just now. She's hurt and needs tending." Martha's maternal instincts immediately took over. "Bring her into our wagon. My Henry's gone hunting with the other men. There's room." Vaughn carefully gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her height. Her skin was hot with fever, yet she trembled as though freezing. He carried her to the Henderson wagon and laid her gently on the pallet Martha had quickly prepared. "I'll fetch some water and bandages," Martha said, already moving with purpose. "And wake Ellen, she was a nurse during the war." Vaughn nodded, his eyes never leaving the mysterious woman's face. Even covered in dirt and clearly suffering, there was something striking about her features, a quiet strength in the set of her jaw, a gentle curve to her lips. He found himself wondering what color her eyes might be. "Who are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "And what kind of trouble are you running from?" As if in response, the woman's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of amber honey. For a brief moment, they focused on Vaughn's face with startling clarity before panic set in. She tried to sit up, a strangled cry escaping her lips. "Easy now," Vaughn said softly, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here. They'll find me," she whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking from thirst. "They always find me. No one's finding you that I don't want finding you," Vaughn assured her with quiet confidence. "I'm Vaughn Sullivan. You're with a wagon train bound for California. What's your name, miss?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the wagon interior before returning to his face. Something in his steady gaze must have reassured her. "Josephine," she finally said. "Josephine Bennett. Well, Miss Bennett, you look like you could use some water and rest. Then, when you're ready, maybe you can tell me who they are." Martha returned with water, bandages, and Ellen Peterson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whose expression softened at the sight of their injured guest. The women gently urged Vaughn outside while they tended to Josephine's wounds and helped her into clean clothing. Vaughn paced outside the wagon, his mind racing. The wagon train was vulnerable 20 families with dreams bigger than their experience, making their way west with all their worldly possessions. If this woman had brought trouble with her, they needed to know. After what seemed like an eternity, Martha emerged from the wagon. "She's resting now," Martha reported. "Poor thing's been shot just a graze. Thank the Lord, and she's half-starved and exhausted." Ellen gave her something to help her sleep. "Did she say anything?" Vaughn asked. Martha nodded gravely. "Says she witnessed the McClintock gang rob a stagecoach 3 days back. They killed everyone else, and she only escaped because she'd stepped away from the coach when they attacked. Been running ever since, with those outlaws hunting her." Vaughn's jaw tightened. The McClintock gang was notorious throughout the territory, ruthless men who killed without conscience and left no witnesses. If they were tracking Josephine, the entire wagon train could be in danger. "I'll double the watch tonight," he decided. "And we should move out as soon as possible. Put some distance between us and her trail." Martha touched his arm. "Vaughn, she can't travel yet. Ellen says she needs at least a day of rest, or the fever might take her." Vaughn ran a hand through his dark hair, weighing their options. "Then we'll stay put and strengthen our defenses. I'll talk to the other men when they return from hunting." Throughout the day, as the camp buzzed with activity and whispered conversations about their mysterious visitor, Vaughn found himself drawn back to the Henderson wagon. Each time, he told himself he was merely checking on a potential threat to the group. Each time, he stayed a little longer, watching Josephine sleep, noting how her features softened in repose, how her breathing had steadied. When evening fell, Josephine awakened to find Vaughn sitting nearby, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. "You stayed," she observed, her voice stronger than before. Vaughn looked up, his hands never pausing in their work. Someone needed to keep watch. "Are you the leader of this wagon train?" "No, madam. Just hired protection." He set the rifle aside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she admitted with a weak smile that transformed her face, hinting at the woman she might be when not running for her life. "But better than this morning." Vaughn handed her a cup of broth that Martha had left warming by the small stove. "Mrs. Henderson says you need to eat." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the cup, and Vaughn felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. He quickly withdrew his hand, unsettled by his reaction. "Thank you," Josephine said, sipping the broth carefully. "For everything. Your coat this morning, bringing me here." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. Most men would have been more suspicious of a strange woman appearing in their camp. "Who says I'm not suspicious?" Vaughn replied, but there was no hostility in his tone. "Mrs. Henderson told me about the McClintock gang. That's serious trouble, Miss Bennett." Josephine's hands trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of broth. "I know. I never meant to bring danger to your people. I was just so tired, and when I saw the wagons." She shook her head. "I'll leave tomorrow. Find my own way to the nearest town." "And get yourself killed?" Vaughn's voice sharpened. "The McClintocks don't give up that easy. You're the only witness to their latest crime." "Then what do you suggest?" Josephine challenged, a flash of spirit lighting her amber eyes. "I can't stay here and put everyone at risk." Vaughn studied her for a long moment. "You'll stay with the train. We're better protected as a group, and we're heading west anyway. Once we reach Fort Wilson, you can give your testimony to the Army. They've been after the McClintock gang for years." "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know enough," Vaughn said simply. "Get some rest, Miss Bennett. Tomorrow will be a long day." As he turned to leave, Josephine caught his sleeve. "My father used to say you can tell a man's character by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return." Her eyes held his, sincere and searching. "You're a good man, Mr. Sullivan." Vaughn wasn't sure how to respond to that. It had been a long time since anyone had called him good. He nodded once, awkwardly, and stepped out into the night, troubled by the warmth spreading through his chest at her words. The next morning brought new challenges. Josephine's fever had broken, and though still weak, she insisted on not being a burden. Martha Henderson had taken the young woman under her wing, providing her with a spare dress and helping her wash her long chestnut hair until it shone in the morning light. When Vaughn saw her emerge from the wagon, standing tall despite her ordeal, Something stirred within him that he hadn't felt in years. She'd tied her hair back with a simple ribbon, and the borrowed dress, though a bit large, somehow enhanced her natural grace. She caught him staring and offered a tentative smile that he found himself returning before he could think better of it. The wagon train leaders had agreed to continue their journey, with extra precautions in place. Josephine would travel in the Henderson wagon, and the men would take turns scouting wider perimeters to watch for any sign of pursuit. As they prepared to depart, Vaughn approached Josephine with a spare revolver. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, holding out the weapon. She took it with practiced ease, checking the chambers and the action before tucking it into the pocket Martha had sewn into her borrowed dress. "My father was a sheriff in Colorado before he died. He made sure I could protect myself." Vaughn raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Good. Keep it close." "I'll try not to need it," she replied. Then, more softly, "But thank you for trusting me with it." "Trust has nothing to do with it," Vaughn said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Handing a loaded weapon to someone you distrusted was a fool's errand. It's just practical. For the next 3 days, the wagon train made steady progress westward. Josephine regained her strength rapidly, soon helping with cooking and other chores. She had a way about her that put people at ease, Vaughn noticed. Children flocked to her as she told them stories in the evenings, and even the most suspicious of the settlers warmed to her presence. Vaughn found himself watching her more often than was necessary, telling himself it was just caution. Yet he couldn't deny the way his pulse quickened when she laughed, or how he found excuses to ride near the Henderson wagon during the day's journey. On the 4th night, as they made camp near a small creek, Vaughn found Josephine sitting alone by the water's edge, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. Without thinking too deeply about his motivations, he approached and sat beside her. "Beautiful night," he commented, instantly feeling foolish for stating the obvious. Josephine nodded, not seeming to mind the banality. "I never saw stars like this back east. It's as if there are twice as many out here." "Where are you from originally?" Vaughn asked, realizing how little he actually knew about her. "Boston, originally," she replied. "My mother died when I was 16. Father took a position as sheriff in a small mining town in Colorado afterward. He was killed in the line of duty 3 years ago." She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. "I was engaged to be married to the town banker's son, but when I discovered he was embezzling from his father's bank, he threatened to kill me." Vaughn listened silently, pieces of her story falling into place. "I left with just what I could carry," she continued. "I've been working my way west ever since, taking jobs as a schoolteacher when I can find them. I was on that stagecoach heading to a position in Tucson when—" Her voice faltered. "When the McClintocks attacked," Vaughn finished for her. She nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "They killed the driver first, then the man riding shotgun. There were 3 passengers inside, a young couple and an elderly gentleman. I'd stepped away for a moment of privacy when I heard the shots." Her hands trembled at the memory. "I saw them drag the bodies out, take everything of value. And then one of them, their leader, I think, looked right in my direction." "But you got away," Vaughn said, instinctively moving closer to her. "I ran. I've been running ever since. Until you found me." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Vaughn felt as though she could see straight through to the parts of himself he kept hidden from everyone else. "Why were you up so early that morning?" Vaughn hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his personal habits. "I don't sleep much. Not anymore." "Nightmares?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard with its accuracy. "Sometimes," he admitted. "War leaves its mark." "You fought in the rebellion?" "Union cavalry. Saw things no man should see." Vaughn rarely spoke of his service, but something about the quiet night and Josephine's gentle presence loosened his tongue. "Came west afterward, looking for open spaces and fewer people. Yet here you are, surrounded by settlers," Josephine observed with a small smile. Vaughn shrugged. "Man's got to eat. Guarding wagon trains pays better than most honest work these days." "Is that all it is? Just a job?" The question hung in the air between them. Vaughn stared out at the rippling creek, considering his answer. "Started that way," he finally said. "But these folks, they've got dreams. Hopes for something better. Sometimes I think they're fools for believing in new beginnings, but other times—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the mixture of envy and admiration he felt for the settlers' optimism. Other times you wonder if maybe they're onto something? Josephine suggested. Vaughn glanced at her, surprised again by how easily she seemed to read him. Maybe. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the gentle sound of the creek. Finally, Josephine spoke again. I haven't thanked you properly. For finding me. For the coat. No need, Vaughn said quickly, uncomfortable with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, Josephine said with quiet certainty. Not anyone. She reached out and briefly touched his hand, the contact sending that same inexplicable warmth through him. Good night, Mr. Sullivan. As she rose to return to camp, Vaughn found himself wishing she would stay longer. The realization troubled him he couldn't afford attachments, not in his line of work, and certainly not to a woman who brought danger in her wake. Yet as he watched her walk away, the moonlight casting her silhouette against the dark landscape, Vaughn Sullivan acknowledged a truth he'd been avoiding for days. Josephine Bennett had already found her way past his carefully constructed defenses, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to rebuild them. The following day brought the first sign of trouble. Vaughn was riding point, scanning the horizon, when he spotted dust in the distance, riders approaching fast from the east. He signaled to the wagon master and galloped back to warn the train. Could be nothing, he told the gathered men, though his instincts told him otherwise. But we should prepare for the worst. Get the women and children into the center of the circle when we make camp. Double the watch tonight. Josephine approached him as the others dispersed to relay the orders. It's them, isn't it? She asked, her face composed despite the fear in her eyes. Don't know yet, Vaughn answered honestly. Could be military patrol, could be friendly travelers. Or it could be the McClintock gang, she pressed. Don't protect me from the truth, Vaughn. I'm not some delicate flower that will wilt at the first sign of danger. The use of his first name shouldn't have affected him so strongly, but Vaughn found himself momentarily distracted by the way it sounded in her voice. No, you certainly aren't, he agreed. But there's no sense borrowing trouble until we know for sure. Josephine studied his face, then nodded. What can I do to help? Stay close to the center wagons. Keep that revolver handy. He hesitated, then added, and if things go badly, you ride out hard and fast. Head northwest toward Fort Wilson. I'm not abandoning these people, she protested. If it is the McClintocks, you're the one they want, Vaughn countered, his voice low and urgent. The rest might be spared if you're not here. Or they might kill everyone anyway, Josephine argued. These men don't leave witnesses, remember? Vaughn ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Just promise me you'll use your judgment. These folks have children to protect. Something in his tone must have reached her, because Josephine's expression softened. I promise I won't let anyone else die for me if I can help it. It wasn't exactly what he'd asked for, but Vaughn knew it was the best he would get. He nodded once, then mounted his horse to rejoin the scouts watching the approaching riders. By mid-afternoon, the identity of the riders became clear: 6 men, heavily armed, led by a tall figure in a distinctive black hat. Even at a distance, Vaughn recognized the description of Ezekiel McClintock from wanted posters throughout the territory. The wagon train formed its defensive circle early, everyone working with quiet efficiency born of fear. Vaughn positioned the armed men strategically, ensuring no approach to the camp would go undefended. All the while, he kept track of Josephine, who was helping Martha Henderson secure their wagon. As dusk approached, the riders halted just beyond rifle range. One broke away from the group, approaching alone with his hands visible. That'll be their scout, Vaughn told the wagon master. They'll want to assess our defenses before deciding whether to attack. We've got 15 armed men, the wagon master said nervously. Surely they won't risk it. Vaughn's expression was grim. McClintock doesn't care about odds, only results. He stepped forward to meet the approaching rider, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. Evening, the rider called out, stopping his horse a safe distance away. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a patchy beard and cold eyes. Name's Tucker. My friends and I are looking for a woman pretty thing with brown hair. Seen anyone like that recently? Lots of women with brown hair in the world, Vaughn replied evenly. Any particular reason you're looking for one? Tucker's smile didn't reach his eyes. She's my boss's sweetheart. Run off with some family heirlooms. He's mighty upset about it. That's so. Vaughn kept his tone neutral, though anger burned in his gut at the blatant lie. Well, we haven't seen any strange women traveling alone. Just our own families heading to California. Tucker made a show of looking past Vaughn at the circled wagons. Mind if we have a look for ourselves? Won't take but a minute. I'm afraid I do mind, Vaughn said firmly. These folks are tired, and we've got young children sleeping. Whatever trouble you're having with your boss's sweetheart, it's not our concern. The young outlaw's expression hardened. You sure you want to take that position, mister? My boss isn't a patient man. Neither am I, Vaughn replied coldly. You and your friends should move on. Now, Tucker studied him for a long moment, then shrugged with exaggerated casualness. Your funeral. He turned his horse around, calling over his shoulder. We'll be seeing you again real soon. Vaughn watched him ride back to the waiting group. The outlaws conferred briefly, then withdrew further into the gathering darkness. But they didn't leave instead. They made camp within sight of the wagon train, a clear message that this confrontation wasn't over. When Vaughn returned to the wagons, Josephine was waiting for him, her face drawn with concern. It's them, isn't it? She asked quietly. Yes, Vaughn confirmed. They're looking for you. Josephine closed her eyes briefly. I should leave. Tonight. While it's dark. And go where? Vaughn demanded. They'd run you down before dawn. Better me than an entire wagon train of innocent people. Vaughn took her arm, leading her away from curious ears. Listen to me, Josephine. Running now is exactly what they want. They've got men who can track a ghost through a sandstorm. Our best chance, your best chance, is to stay together and reach Fort Wilson. How far? 2 days hard travel, Vaughn admitted. Maybe 3 with the wagons. Josephine shook her head. They won't wait that long. You saw them making camp. They'll attack tonight or tomorrow. Maybe, Vaughn conceded. But we're ready for them. And they don't know for certain you're with us. Don't they? Josephine challenged. They've been tracking me for days. You think they haven't found where I slept under that wagon? Where I bled? Vaughn had no answer for that. The odds were indeed that the McClintocks knew exactly where Josephine was. They were simply deciding how best to get to her. We'll set extra watches tonight, he finally said. First sign of trouble, we'll be ready. But as he walked away to organize the defenses, Vaughn couldn't shake the feeling that they were all balancing on a knife's edge, and that before the next sunset, blood would be spilled. The night passed in tense watchfulness. The McClintocks made no move against the camp, but their fires burned through till dawn, a constant reminder of the threat lurking just beyond the safety of the circled wagons. With the first light of morning, Vaughn called the men together to discuss their options. We can't stay here, he told them bluntly. Water's limited, and they've got us pinned down. We need to move toward Fort Wilson. Moving makes us vulnerable, one of the settlers argued. We should wait them out. They won't leave, Vaughn countered. Not until they get what they came for. All eyes turned to where Josephine stood at the edge of the group, her back straight and her chin held high despite the weight of their stares. I still say we should turn her over, muttered a thin-faced man named Wilson. No offense, miss, but my family didn't sign up for this. Martha Henderson stepped forward indignantly. James Wilson. I never thought I'd hear such a thing from a God-fearing man. This young woman witnessed a terrible crime, and those men want to silence her permanently. Would you really hand her over to murderers? Wilson had the grace to look ashamed, but his fear remained. What chance do we have against professional killers? Better than you might think, Vaughn interjected. McClintock has 6 men with him. We have 15 who can shoot. Our problem isn't numbers, it's that we're slowed down by the wagons. So what do you suggest? The wagon master asked. Vaughn took a deep breath. We split up. I take Miss Bennett and ride hard for Fort Wilson. The rest of you head northwest, off the main trail. By the time McClintock realizes she's gone, you'll have a good lead, and with fewer men pursuing. A murmur ran through the group as they considered the plan. Josephine stepped forward. Mr. Sullivan is right about one thing: you'll all be safer if I'm not with you, she said clearly. But I won't risk his life either. I'll go alone. Not happening, Vaughn said flatly. It's my decision, Josephine insisted. And it's a foolish one, Vaughn shot back. You wouldn't make it 10 miles. They glared at each other, neither willing to back down, until Martha Henderson cleared her throat. If I may, she said, looking between them, Mr. Sullivan's plan makes the most sense. 2 can travel faster than 1, and Miss Bennett will need protection even if she escapes the McClintocks. These are dangerous lands for a woman alone. The wagon master nodded slowly. I agree. And the good Lord knows I don't want to face those outlaws without our best gun hand. He looked at Vaughn with newfound respect. You get her to Fort Wilson safely, Sullivan. We'll manage. The decision made, preparations began immediately. Vaughn selected the 2 fastest horses from the train, while Martha packed provisions for their journey. Josephine changed into men's clothing provided by the Hendersons' teenage son trousers and a shirt that would allow her to ride astride and move more freely if they needed to abandon the horses. As dawn brightened into morning, Vaughn found himself alone with Josephine behind the Henderson wagon, going over the route one final time. We'll cut through Copperhead Canyon, he explained, pointing to a rough map he'd drawn in the dirt. It's risky, narrow passages, potential for ambush, but it shaves half a day off the journey to Fort Wilson. Josephine nodded, committing the route to memory. And if we get separated? We won't, Vaughn said firmly. But if we do, she persisted. Vaughn sighed. Head north until you hit the river, then follow it west. The fort is on the north bank. Josephine studied his face, her amber eyes serious. Why are you doing this, Vaughn? Risking your life for a woman you barely know. The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? His job was to protect the wagon train, not to go chasing across dangerous territory with a woman who had catastrophe following in her wake. Yet the thought of sending her alone, or worse, staying with the wagons while someone else escorted her, made his chest tighten with something close to panic. Because it's the right thing to do, he finally said, the words inadequate even to his own ears. Josephine seemed about to press further when a shout from the perimeter interrupted them. Riders coming. Fast. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, pulling Josephine up with him. Time to go? Now. They rushed to where their horses waited, already saddled and loaded. The camp had erupted into activity, men grabbing weapons, women hurrying children into wagons. Remember the plan, Vaughn called to the wagon master as he mounted. Northwest, off the main trail. Don't stop until nightfall. The wagon master nodded grimly. Godspeed, Sullivan. Josephine swung into her saddle with surprising grace for a city-born woman, gathering the reins confidently. She'd tied her hair back severely and pulled a wide-brimmed hat low over her eyes, giving her a boyish appearance from a distance. Ready? Vaughn asked. Instead of answering, Josephine leaned across the space between their horses and pressed something into his hand, her locket. For luck, she said simply. Before Vaughn could respond, gunfire erupted from the direction of the McClintock camp. The outlaws had seen the activity and were making their move. Ride, Vaughn shouted, spurring his horse toward the southern edge of the camp, away from both the approaching outlaws and the route the wagon train would take. Josephine followed close behind, bent low over her mount's neck as they galloped across the open ground. More shots rang out behind them, but they were already at full gallop, dust billowing in their wake. Vaughn risked a glance back and saw 2 riders breaking away from the main group of outlaws, giving chase while the others engaged with the wagon train. They've seen us, he called to Josephine. Push harder. They rode at breakneck speed for nearly an hour, the landscape blurring around them as they aimed for the distant outline of rocky hills that marked the beginning of Copperhead Canyon. The 2 pursuers remained doggedly on their trail, neither gaining nor losing ground. As they neared the canyon entrance, Vaughn made a split-second decision. Follow me, he shouted, suddenly veering off their path and heading toward a dense thicket of mesquite and scrub oak. Josephine matched his move without hesitation, trusting his judgment completely. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces and tearing at their clothing. On the other side, Vaughn reined in sharply behind an outcropping of rock. Dismount, he ordered, already sliding from his saddle. Quickly. They tied their horses in the deepest part of the thicket. Then Vaughn led Josephine to a position where they could see the canyon entrance while remaining hidden. What are we doing? Josephine whispered. Evening the odds, Vaughn replied grimly, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. Understanding dawned in Josephine's eyes. She pulled the revolver from her belt, checking it with practiced efficiency. They didn't have to wait long. The 2 McClintock men appeared minutes later, slowing their horses as they approached the canyon, clearly uncertain which way their quarry had gone. They conferred briefly, pointing in different directions, before one of them noticed the broken branches where Vaughn and Josephine had entered the thicket. "There," the outlaw shouted, pointing. Vaughn took aim with his rifle. "Don't shoot unless you have to," he murmured to Josephine. "Let me handle this." The first shot cracked through the air like thunder, catching the lead rider high in the chest. He toppled from his horse without a sound. The second outlaw reacted quickly, diving from his saddle and rolling behind a boulder as Vaughn's second shot kicked up dust where he'd been standing. "You're dead, mister," the outlaw shouted. "McClintock's gonna skin you alive." Instead of responding, Vaughn shifted position silently, motioning for Josephine to stay put. The outlaw fired blindly toward their previous location, the bullets harmlessly embedding in the rocks. In the moment of silence that followed, Vaughn circled wide, approaching the outlaw's position from the side. He moved with the stealth born of years spent hunting, both animals and men. The outlaw never saw him coming. One moment, he was peering cautiously around his boulder. The next, Vaughn's rifle barrel was pressed against the back of his head. "Drop the gun," Vaughn ordered coldly. The man froze, then slowly set his revolver on the ground. "Don't shoot. Please." "How many men does McClintock have in total?" "Not just the ones we saw." "8, the outlaw stammered. "Just 8, including the boss." "And how many are following us right now?" "Just us 2. The others stayed to deal with the wagon train." Vaughn's heart clenched at the thought of the settlers facing 6 determined killers, but he kept his expression impassive. "Is that the truth?" "I swear it," the man insisted. "The boss figures the woman is the priority. Says we can always catch up with the wagons later." Josephine had approached silently, her revolver trained steadily on the kneeling outlaw. "Why does McClintock want me dead so badly?" she demanded. "I'm just one witness." The outlaw glanced between them nervously. "It ain't just the stagecoach robbery, madam." "What you saw? That was McClintock killing a federal marshal who'd infiltrated the gang. Government's put a special bounty on his head for that." Vaughn and Josephine exchanged a significant look. This explained the gang's unusual persistence. "What's your name?" Vaughn asked the outlaw. "Riley. Sam Riley." "Well, Riley, you've got 2 choices. You can take a message back to McClintock, or you can join your friend over there." Vaughn nodded toward the dead outlaw. Riley swallowed hard. "What message?" "Tell him the woman is under my protection now. Tell him I'm Vaughn Sullivan, formerly of the 7th Cavalry." He might recognize the name. Recognition flickered in Riley's eyes. The Ghost Rider? From the Washita campaign. Vaughn didn't confirm or deny the nickname he'd earned during the war, but his silence was answer enough. "Tell McClintock if he wants the woman, he'll have to come through me. And tell him I never miss twice." Riley nodded vigorously. "I'll tell him. Word for word." "Take your friend's horse," Vaughn instructed, stepping back, but keeping his rifle ready. "Ride straight east. If I see you following us again, I won't be so merciful." The outlaw scrambled to obey, mounting his dead companion's horse and galloping away without looking back. Vaughn watched until he disappeared from view, then turned to find Josephine staring at him with an unreadable expression. "The Ghost Rider?" she asked quietly. Vaughn's jaw tightened. "A name from another time. It doesn't matter now. It matters if it keeps us alive," Josephine countered. Then, more gently, "I'm not judging you, Vaughn. We all have pasts we'd rather not discuss." Before he could respond, she stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm, the touch burning through the fabric of his shirt. "Thank you for everything you're doing." Vaughn found himself unable to look away from her face from the sincerity in her eyes, the strand of hair that had escaped her hat to curl against her cheek, the soft curve of her mouth that he suddenly, desperately wanted to taste. The realization jolted him back to his senses. This was neither the time nor the place for such thoughts. "We should move," he said gruffly, stepping back. "That message might slow McClintock down if he believes it, but we can't count on it." They retrieved their horses and continued toward Copperhead Canyon, riding at a more sustainable pace now that their immediate pursuers had been dealt with. As they entered the narrow passage between towering red rock walls, Vaughn remained vigilant, aware that the confined space made them vulnerable to ambush. "Tell me about this place," Josephine said as they navigated the winding canyon floor. "How did it get its name?" "Same way most places out here get named the obvious," Vaughn replied, gesturing to the rocky ledges above them. "Crawling with copperheads in the warmer months. We're lucky it's early spring, they're still mostly dormant." "Mostly," Josephine arched an eyebrow. Vaughn's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Mostly, they rode in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the steady clip of hooves on stone and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The canyon twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing until they had to ride single file, other times opening into small, sheltered valleys where desert wildflowers grew in surprising abundance. In one such opening, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack from their provisions. Sitting on a sun-warmed rock, Josephine studied Vaughn as he checked their surroundings with habitual thoroughness. "You never really answered my question," she said finally. "About why you're helping me." Vaughn continued scanning the canyon rim, avoiding her gaze. "I told you it's the right thing to do." "Is that all?" she pressed. This time, he did look at her, really look at her, the woman who had stumbled into his life just days ago, yet somehow seemed to understand him better than people he'd known for years. The woman whose courage and determination had impressed him from the start. The woman whose smile made him think dangerous thoughts about futures he had no right to imagine. "No," he admitted quietly. "That's not all." Something shifted in Josephine's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "Vaughn, The sharp crack of a rifle shot interrupted whatever she had been about to say. The bullet struck the rock inches from where they sat, sending stone fragments flying. "Get down," Vaughn shouted, diving toward Josephine and pulling her behind the protective cover of a larger boulder. More shots followed, echoing confusingly through the canyon. "Where are they?" Josephine gasped, pressing herself against the rock. Vaughn peered carefully around the edge, trying to locate their attackers. A flash of movement on the rim caught his eye. At least 2 shooters, maybe more, positioned above them with a clear line of fire into the small valley. "Canyon rim, north side," he reported grimly. "They got ahead of us somehow. I thought you said only 2 were following us." "That's what Riley claimed," Vaughn said, cursing himself for accepting the outlaw's word. "McClintock must have split his forces differently than we thought." Another volley of shots peppered their position, one bullet passing close enough that Vaughn felt the displacement of air against his cheek. "We're pinned down," he muttered, assessing their increasingly desperate situation. The horses had bolted at the first shots, taking with them most of their supplies and water. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the rocky terrain offered limited cover for movement. Josephine checked her revolver, 5 bullets remaining. "How many do you think are up there?" "At least 3, Vaughn replied, ejecting the spent cartridge from his rifle and reloading. "Maybe 4. Any chance of climbing out of this valley? Finding another route?" Vaughn shook his head. "Not without exposing ourselves to their fire. Our best bet is to wait until dark, then try to slip past them." "That's hours away," Josephine pointed out, glancing at the sun high overhead. "And we have no water." Vaughn knew she was right. By nightfall, thirst would become a serious problem in the desert heat. But rushing into the open meant certain death. "I might be able to draw their fire," he suggested grimly. "Give you a chance to make a run for it." Josephine's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare suggest sacrificing yourself, Vaughn Sullivan. We either both get out of this, or neither of us does." The vehemence in her voice startled him. Before he could respond, she continued, "Besides, I have a better idea. Give me your bandana." Puzzled, Vaughn handed over the faded red cloth he wore around his neck. Josephine quickly removed her hat, arranging the bandana inside it and positioning it on the end of Vaughn's rifle barrel. "The oldest trick in the book," she explained with a grim smile. "But it might work." Understanding her plan, Vaughn carefully raised the hat above their cover, as if someone were peering over the rock. Immediately, a shot rang out, tearing through the crown of the hat. "There," Josephine said, pointing to a ledge where a puff of smoke had briefly appeared. "Did you see him?" Vaughn nodded, already taking aim. "Got him." His shot was precise, and a cry of pain echoed through the canyon, followed by the sight of a body tumbling down the steep cliff face. "One down," Vaughn murmured. "Wait," Josephine said suddenly, grabbing his arm. "Listen." Through the ringing in his ears from the gunfire, Vaughn heard it, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, many horses riding hard. "McClintock," Josephine whispered, fear evident in her voice. Vaughn shook his head slowly. "Too many horses, and coming from the west." They exchanged a look of cautious hope. The only significant force west of their position would be cavalry patrol. Vaughn exclaimed as blue uniformed riders came into view at the far end of the valley, rifles at the ready. The shooters on the rim must have seen them too, for they fired a few more desperate shots before the distinctive sound of retreating horses echoed from above. Vaughn stood cautiously, keeping Josephine behind him as he waved to the approaching soldiers. U.S. cavalry, he called. We're civilians under attack. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant with a bushy mustache, rode forward while his men secured the perimeter. Lieutenant James Farrell, Fort Wilson Patrol, he introduced himself. Are you folks all right? We are now, Vaughn replied with genuine relief. I'm Vaughn Sullivan. This is Miss Josephine Bennett. We were headed to Fort Wilson to report a crime when McClintock's gang ambushed us. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. McClintock? We've been hunting that devil for months. He turned to Josephine with newfound interest. What crime are you reporting, madam? I witnessed Ezekiel McClintock murder a federal marshal, Josephine explained, and several others during a stagecoach robbery. Lieutenant Farrell whistled low. Madam, you just became the most valuable witness in the territory. We'll escort you to Fort Wilson immediately. With the cavalry's protection, their journey continued with considerably less peril. The soldiers retrieved their scattered horses and shared water and provisions. By nightfall, they had emerged from Copperhead Canyon and made camp on the open plain, with Fort Wilson visible in the distance as a dark outline against the starry sky. They would reach it by mid-morning tomorrow, Lieutenant Farrell assured them. Josephine would give her testimony to the fort commander, and a proper military pursuit of the McClintock gang would begin. That night, as the camp settled into sleep with soldiers standing watch at regular intervals, Vaughn found himself unable to rest. The day's events replayed in his mind: the ambush, the narrow escape, the moment before the shooting started when he had almost confessed feelings he scarcely understood himself. He rose quietly and walked to the edge of the camp, staring out at the vast, moonlit landscape. Soon, they would reach Fort Wilson. Josephine would be safe, her testimony recorded. The McClintock gang would be hunted by the full might of the U.S. cavalry. And Vaughn would return to the life he'd been living before a chestnut-haired woman slept beneath a wagon and changed everything. The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't explain, or rather, didn't want to explain, because acknowledging it meant admitting how much Josephine Bennett had come to mean to him in just a few short days. Can't sleep either? Vaughn turned to find Josephine approaching, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. Her hair was loose now, falling in waves past her shoulders, and the moonlight silvered her features in a way that made his breath catch. Too much on my mind, he admitted. Josephine came to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that somehow clung to her despite days on the trail. Me too. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the moon's slow journey across the sky. What will you do? Josephine finally asked. After we reach Fort Wilson. Vaughn shrugged, trying to appear more casual than he felt. Go back to the wagon train, I suppose. I've got a job to finish. And after that? Haven't thought about it, he lied. In truth, he'd been thinking of little else since the cavalry had found them of possibilities he'd never considered before meeting her. Josephine turned to face him directly. Before the shooting started, you were about to tell me something. About why you're helping me. Vaughn swallowed hard, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. Was I? You know you were, she said softly. Her hand touched his arm, gentle but insistent. Please, Vaughn. After everything we've been through, don't we deserve honesty between us? The plea in her voice undid him. Vaughn looked down at her upturned face, at the woman who had shown more courage and determination in a few days than most showed in a lifetime, and found he could no longer hide from the truth, not from her, and not from himself. I'm helping you because I couldn't bear not to, he said simply. Because from the moment I found you beneath that wagon, something changed. You changed me, Josephine. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. If anything, she moved closer. How? She whispered. How did I change you? Vaughn struggled to find the right words, and used to expressing such feelings. Before you, I was just existing, moving from one job to the next, one day to the next, not really living, not really feeling. He took a deep breath. You made me remember what it's like to care about someone more than my own survival. Josephine's hand moved from his arm to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with exquisite tenderness. I've been running for so long, she said quietly. Running from my past, from danger, from connections that might lead to more pain. Until you found me. Until you laid your coat over me and made me feel safe for the first time in years. Vaughn covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press his lips against her palm. The small gesture seemed to break whatever remaining restraint existed between them. Josephine rose on her tiptoes as Vaughn bent his head, their lips meeting in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with all the emotion they'd been holding back. His arms encircled her waist, pulling her against him as her hands slid into his hair. The blanket fell unnoticed to the ground as they lost themselves in each other, the rest of the world fading away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to increase the distance between them even that small amount. I don't know what happens tomorrow, he murmured, but I know I don't want to go back to a life without you in it. Josephine's smile was radiant even in the moonlight. Then don't. It won't be easy, Vaughn warned. I'm not a wealthy man. I've got no home to offer you, no stability. I don't need wealth or a grand home, Josephine replied with quiet certainty. I just need you, Vaughn Sullivan. The man who found me when I was lost and never once let me face danger alone. He kissed her again, marveling at how right it felt to hold her, to taste the sweetness of her lips, to feel her heart beating in time with his own. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges they might face, Vaughn knew with absolute clarity that his life had irrevocably changed course the moment he'd found Josephine Bennett sleeping beneath that wagon. And he wouldn't have it any other way. The next morning, they reached Fort Wilson shortly after sunrise. The military outpost was larger than Josephine had expected, a substantial compound of wooden buildings surrounded by a high stockade wall, with the American flag snapping proudly in the breeze above the central parade ground. They were immediately escorted to Commander Bradley's office, where Josephine gave her testimony about the stagecoach robbery and the murder of the federal marshal. The commander, a grizzled veteran with a chest full of medals, listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but otherwise allowing her to tell the story in her own words. When she finished, he nodded gravely. Miss Bennett, your testimony is invaluable. The marshal you saw murdered was one of our best men, working undercover to gather evidence on McClintock's operation. With your eyewitness account, we can finally bring these men to justice. Will you be pursuing them immediately? Vaughn asked. Already have men preparing to ride out, Commander Bradley confirmed. Lieutenant Farrell will lead the expedition with 3 full squads. We've been building toward this moment for months. Josephine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Soon, the men who had haunted her dreams and pursued her across the territory would face justice for their crimes. What about Miss Bennett's safety in the meantime? Vaughn pressed. McClintock is still at large, and he knows she's a witness. The commander stroked his beard thoughtfully. You're welcome to remain at the fort until the situation is resolved, Miss Bennett. We have quarters for civilian visitors, and you'll be under military protection here. Josephine glanced at Vaughn, a silent question in her eyes. Last night had changed everything between them, but they hadn't discussed immediate plans. Vaughn cleared his throat. If it's all the same to you, Commander, I'd like to join Lieutenant Farrell's expedition. I know McClintock's men, and I have a personal stake in seeing them brought to justice. Commander Bradley studied him with newfound interest. Sullivan, you were with the 7th Cavalry during the war, weren't you? I've heard stories. That was a long time ago, sir, Vaughn replied noncommittally. Not so long that those skills wouldn't be useful, the commander countered. Lieutenant Farrell spoke highly of your shooting yesterday. We could use a man of your abilities. Josephine felt her heart constrict at the thought of Vaughn riding out to face McClintock again. Last night's confessions and promises suddenly seemed fragile in the harsh light of day and military pragmatism. Actually, sir, Vaughn said, surprising her, I do have prior commitments. There's a wagon train of settlers counting on my return. Once I know Miss Bennett is safe, I need to rejoin them. The commander nodded his understanding. Of course, family obligations must come first. Not family, sir, Vaughn corrected him. At least, not yet. His eyes met Josephine's, and the meaning behind his words was clear. But a promise is a promise. After leaving the commander's office, Vaughn and Josephine walked slowly across the parade ground, finding a quiet spot beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree where they could speak privately. "You're really going back to the wagon train?" Josephine asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Vaughn took her hands in his. "I gave my word, Josephine. Those people are depending on me to see them safely to California." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "But I'm not suggesting we part ways." Hope fluttered in her chest. "What are you suggesting?" "Come with me," Vaughn said simply. "The Hendersons already think of you as family. There's room in their wagon, and once we reach California—" He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you had other plans? After all this is over." Josephine thought about the teaching position she'd been traveling to when fate intervened, a respectable job in a respectable town, the safe, predictable future she'd been seeking. It seemed impossibly distant now, as though it had been another woman's dream. "My only plan," she said slowly, "is to be wherever you are, Vaughn Sullivan." The smile that transformed his usually serious face made her heart skip. He pulled her into his arms, uncaring of the curious glances from passing soldiers. "I was hoping you'd say that," he murmured against her hair. They spent the day making preparations. The cavalry had located the wagon train, which had successfully evaded the remaining McClintock men and was now just a day's ride from Fort Wilson. Commander Bradley arranged for a military escort to accompany Vaughn and Josephine to rejoin the settlers the following morning. That evening, as they shared a meal in the fort's dining hall, Josephine noticed Vaughn seemed preoccupied, his gaze distant as he absently pushed food around his plate. "What is it?" she asked. "Second thoughts." Vaughn looked up, startled. "About us?" "Never." He set down his fork and reached for her hand across the table. "Actually, I was thinking about the future. Our future. What about it?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "When we reach California, the settlers will all be starting new lives. Building homes, planting crops, establishing businesses." He met her eyes directly. "I've been a drifter for so long, Josephine. Taking whatever jobs came my way, never staying in one place. But that's no life for a family." The word hung between them, full of meaning and possibility. "What are you saying, Vaughn?" Josephine prompted gently, though she thought she knew. "I'm saying I want to build something permanent. With you." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "There's good land available in California. The wagon master mentioned a valley near where they're settling, fertile soil, plenty of water. A man could start a ranch there. A good life." Josephine felt tears pricking at her eyes. "A ranch? You'd want that." "I've worked cattle before," Vaughn said. "No horse is better than most. It would be hard work, especially at first, but—" He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "It's just a thought." "It's a wonderful thought," Josephine assured him, squeezing his hand. "A home of our own. Land that belongs to us. Children someday, perhaps." Vaughn's expression softened at the mention of children. "I'd like that. Very much." The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect traveling weather. As they prepared to depart with their military escort, Commander Bradley approached with news. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, handing Vaughn a telegram. "Just received this from our outpost in Tucson. Lieutenant Farrell's men caught up with McClintock and 3 of his gang yesterday afternoon. There was a firefight." Vaughn read the telegram quickly, then passed it to Josephine. The message was brief but clear. McClintock and 2 of his men were dead. The 3rd had been captured alive and was providing information on the gang's hideouts and past crimes. "It's over," Josephine whispered, scarcely able to believe it. "Really over." "Justice served," Commander Bradley said with satisfaction. "Your testimony was the key, Miss Bennett. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." As they rode out from Fort Wilson an hour later, Josephine felt lighter than she had in years. The fear that had been her constant companion since witnessing the stagecoach massacre had finally lifted, replaced by a growing excitement about the future with Vaughn at her side. They reached the wagon train by mid-afternoon, receiving a hero's welcome from the settlers who had feared for their safety. Martha Henderson embraced Josephine like a long-lost daughter, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We prayed every night for your safe return," Martha told them. leading them back to her wagon where her husband Henry waited with broad smiles. "When the soldiers found us yesterday and said you were at Fort Wilson, it was like the good Lord himself had answered our prayers." That evening, as the settlers gathered around the campfire to hear the tale of their adventures, Vaughn surprised everyone, Josephine most of all, by standing up in front of the entire group and dropping to one knee before her. "Josephine Bennett," he said, his voice steady despite the unprecedented public display. "I know we haven't known each other long in terms of days and weeks, but I've learned that time measures poorly against experience, and in the short time I've known you, I've experienced more life, more feeling, than in all the years before." A hush fell over the gathered settlers as they realized what was happening. Martha Henderson clutched her husband's arm, her eyes shining with happy tears. "I don't have much to offer yet," Vaughn continued, taking Josephine's trembling hand in his. "No ring, no home built. But I promise you this. I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of your love, building a future where you'll never have to run or hide again." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me, Josephine? Will you make a home with me in California?" Josephine's heart felt too full for her chest, joy spilling over in tears that streamed down her cheeks. "Yes," she managed through the emotion choking her voice. "Yes, Vaughn Sullivan, I will marry you." The settlers erupted in cheers and applause as Vaughn rose to his feet and pulled Josephine into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that held all the hope and love they'd found in each other. 2 weeks later, they were married beneath an ancient oak tree at a way station 3 days' ride from their California destination. The wagon master, who had authority to perform marriages in the absence of clergy, officiated the simple ceremony. Martha Henderson had worked tirelessly to alter one of her own dresses for Josephine, a cream-colored gown with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs. Vaughn, standing tall and proud in a clean shirt borrowed from Henry Henderson, watched with wonder as Josephine walked toward him through the gathering of settlers. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes when he first found her beneath the wagon was gone, replaced by a radiant happiness that took his breath away. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she reached his side. "So are you," she replied with a smile that was for him alone. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises of love and fidelity spoken beneath the open sky with the rolling California hills as witness. When the wagon master pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn gathered Josephine into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength, kissing her as their new friends cheered and celebrated around them. The wagon train reached its destination 3 days later, a lush valley nestled between protective mountains, with a clear river running through its center. The settlers immediately began the process of dividing land and establishing their new community. True to his word, Vaughn secured a promising plot of land for their ranch, 200 acres of fertile pasture with access to the river and a gentle rise where they could build their home. With help from the other settlers, they constructed a simple but sturdy cabin before winter set in, a place of their own where they could begin their life together. The work was hard, just as Vaughn had predicted. They started small, with a few cattle purchased from a neighboring rancher and 2 good breeding mares. Every day brought new challenges, from mending fences to digging a well, from planting crops to navigating the complexities of married life. But every night, as they lay together in the bed Vaughn had crafted with his own hands, they marveled at how far they had come from that fateful morning when she had slept beneath a wagon and he had found her there, covering her with his coat in a simple act of kindness that had changed both their lives forever. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The tiny cabin grew into a proper ranch house as their fortunes improved. The Sullivan Ranch became known throughout the valley for its fine horses and quality cattle. Vaughn's expertise with livestock and Josephine's head for business proved a formidable combination. On a warm spring morning in 1883, Vaughn stood on the porch of their home, watching as Josephine moved through the garden with their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, trailing behind her like a shadow. The little girl's chestnut hair, so like her mother's, gleamed in the sunlight as she solemnly helped plant seedlings, her small face a study in concentration. From inside the house came the unmistakable wail of their 6-month-old son, Samuel, waking from his nap. Vaughn smiled to himself, still sometimes unable to believe that this was his life, this home, this land, this family that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. Josephine looked up from her gardening, meeting his gaze across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that simple connection still sent a thrill through him, the knowledge that of all the paths their lives might have taken, somehow they had found their way to each other. She smiled, that same radiant smile that had captivated him from the start, and Vaughn Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that finding Josephine Bennett sleeping beneath that wagon had been more than luck or coincidence. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered. As he walked across the yard to join his family, Vaughn reflected that some men spent their entire lives searching for treasure, never realizing that the greatest riches couldn't be measured in gold or silver, but in moments like these, in the laughter of children, in land that sustained them, and in the enduring love of a woman who had been brave enough to stop running and build a home with him. A home where neither of them would ever have to sleep beneath a wagon again.